Good morning. Welcome to our morning session. This is discovering the genocidal nature of the 20th century. We have four presenters who will speak for 15 minutes each. Then we will break, and then we will discuss. So we'll go in the order of the program. So, Professor Suni.
Thank you. I thank the organizer for inviting me. I feel a little bit like the dog in the manger here, but I will try to keep baby Jesus sleeping. While some would limit the term genocide to the Judeicide of the Nazis during World War II, others extend the meaning of genocide to any incident of intentional mass killing. In my view, the first practice narrows the term too drastically, and the latter unnecessarily dilutes the concept and clouds the possibility of explanation of why genocide. Analysts, in my view, ought to refrain from collapsing all forms of mass violence into a single type, usually entitled genocide, a term that in our own time has regrettably been stretched to cover quite distinct forms of crimes against humanity. As defined in the United Nations Genocide Convention, genocide is about the killing of a people, not the killing of people. That is, the intentional mass murder is directed against a cultural, national, ethnic, or religious group, in the exact words of the conventions, acts committed with intent to destroy in whole and part national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups. Genocide, in other words, in legal terms and international law, is a subset, Norman corrects me on this, but it's related to then crimes against humanity, and a larger category certainly would include the Holodomor, the Kazakh famine, and other state-directed attacks on social and political groups. In order to make famines a genocide under this definition, it would be necessary to demonstrate that they were ethnocides rather than simply mass killings, and that's not that difficult to do since often, as I've written elsewhere, classes and nationalities overlap quite intimately. Also, of course, intention as well as is the principal target is key. For me, the Holodomor and the Kazakh famine were imperial assaults of a center against distinct peripheries, but it would be, in my opinion, far too far to go to reduce them to Russians versus Ukrainians or Kazakhs, as some recent writers like Anne Applebaum have done. Motive and intentions should also be specified, and in my own work, I've tried to distinguish between different kinds of violence against Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, different types of intentional and non-intentional violence. Before the genocide of 1915, there were other incidents of mass killing of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, most importantly, the Hamidian massacres of the 1890s, and the pogrom in the city of Adana in 1909, both of which have been folded by many scholars, mostly Armenians, into the genocide. In much of my work, I've tried to disaggregate these disastrous events, even though it's easy enough to show connections and even similarities among them. Now, while to victims and to moral observers, the effects of violence are similar, no matter what the intentions or motivations of perpetrators, I believe that for social scientists and historians, distinctions among cases of mass killing are made in order to have some explanatory power, in order for us to understand their causes. For analytical purposes, I'm going to propose that we should distinguish between different forms of violence. One I call exemplary violence. That is, violence used or deployed to terrorize people into submission and obedience. And that exemplary violence, which I would say the Hamidian massacres were a case of, should be distinguished from excisionary or exterminationist violence, like the genocide of 1915, which aims to eliminate special kinds of people, in the case of genocide, a designated ethno-national, religious, or racial group, that is, a people. These are both different kinds of violence from residual violence, or what in America we conveniently call collateral damage, caused by policies or actions intended for other purposes than the actual killing of a people. as in state-induced famines. The Hamidian massacres of Armenians and Assyrians in the mid-1890s would also include this, in my view, is primarily exemplary violence. The Armenian genocide was an extraordinary and singular example of a new regime of violence where exemplary violence gave way to excisionary violence, the state effort to eliminate whole peoples, in this case the Armenians and Assyrians, from the imperial territory, or at least to disperse them, Islamize them, marginalize them. The title of my book is Let Them Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, Talat Pasha's famous phrase, in order to destroy them as a coherent and conscious people able to maintain a social, political, or even cultural existence. So genocide is about making this group, this people, unable to reproduce itself in the old way. The Ukrainian Holodomor, as far as I understand it, and I'm not an expert on this, but what I've read, catastrophic as death from famine was, in my reading, is an example of residual violence, a massive death from ill-formed and vicious policies directed toward a different end than the elimination of a people or a given category of people. Now, the Ottoman Empire, which I've spent a lot of time studying, and I'm no fan of it, by the way, given the persistent Ottoman policy of using violence as a form of government, has often then led to people to assume a kind of continuity theory. That is, rather than a rupture between these different kinds of violence, that the earlier violences are connected intimately, organically to the genocide. There are similarities, and those are important. The perpetrators, for instance, were state actors and their agents. The victims were Christian Armenians and Assyrians. The state disguised its involvement and denied its responsibilities. Habits and practices of mass killing became routine and were thought to be justified. Similar arguments about state security against treacherous, rebellious people were used, and both the Hamidian and Young Turk governments that came to power after 1908 sought to nationalize the empire, that is, to Islamize or even Turkify Anatolia as a secure base for the ruling people of the empire. I have argued quite often that the genocide itself was an empire-preserving or empire-saving effort, not, as in the Kemalist Republic, an effort to create an ethno-national state. But, again, all in history things are very subtle and distinctions have to be maintained. There was a nationalizing project as well. That is, we're going to have an empire. We're going to have one superior Herrenvolk, Turks, or maybe Muslims, over others. It's not going to be a kind of egalitarian or homogeneous nation state, but nevertheless, it's going to be more Turkic, more Islamic, and Armenians are going to be put in their place, if not eliminated altogether. Okay. I talk a lot in the paper, and I don't have much time today, apparently, about Abdulhameed, and how, indeed, though we cannot show directly that he ordered the mass killings of something like 300,000 Armenians in the 1890s, he certainly encouraged and permitted officers and ordinary people to rise against Armenians and was happy to reduce the Armenian presence in Anatolia. But Abdulhameed's modernizing program, as he saw it, contained within it a conservative, restorationist agenda that sought order above all. His personal paranoia reflected his own and more broadly social anxieties about unregulated change, the loss of status of Muslims domestically and of his empire itself internationally, and the special position within and outside Ottoman lands of a certain people, the Armenians, whose talents he recognized and resented. Armenians had to be controlled, taught a lesson, reduced in influence and numbers, but not erased from the multicultural mosaic of the empire. Abdulhameed, as I said, was an empire preserver, not an ethno-national nation-making. Nor was he a demographic radical or ethnic cleanser, as was Talat and the Young Turks in 1915. Okay. Most analysts in the first decade agree that in the first decade of the 20th century, the Young Turks, when they came to power, moved from a more egalitarian, inclusive, multicultural Ottomanist orientation, in which there was originally an emphasis on equality among the millets, the peoples of the empire, one that would recognize difference, over time to a more nationalist position in which the superiority of ethnic Turks, already implicit in the Ottomanist view itself, and the privileged position within the state would be more explicitly underlined. But this policy of creating a secure Turkey in which Turks would be now totally dominant and Armenians marginalized only became effective during World War I. You heard Norman say last night, something that I've said in my book as well, that without the war, there would have been no genocide. There were other possibilities as well. The toxic mental and emotional mix that resulted, I call this an affective disposition, that created and constructed the Armenians as an existential threat to the empire, then made it rational, justifiable in the eyes of the Young Turks to eliminate the Armenians altogether. This particular explanation, that is the idea that if you want to understand a genocide, you have to look at the perpetrators themselves, who often can be a very small group of very motivated murderers, as it turns out. You look at them and you try to figure out their emotional and cognitive understanding of the world. And this kind of what I would call delusional rationality that they had eventually made it not only desirable, but in their view imperative that the Armenians who threatened them so much to be eliminated. I try to argue in the paper as well that the choice of genocide was not inevitable. It was predicated on long-standing and ever more extreme affective dispositions and attitudes that had demonized the Armenians as a threat that needed to be dealt with. But ultimately, a choice was made. Specific leaders at a particular historical conjuncture during the war, after the defeat at the Battle of Sarıkamış, when the threat was most palpable, decided on this most extreme policy. What to denialists and their sympathizers appeared to be a rational and justified strategic choice, a matter of security, to eliminate a rebellious and sadistic population. In my book, They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, this is seen as the outcome of the young leader's pathological construction of an Armenian enemy. The actions that the Young Turks decided upon were based in this emotional disposition that led to distorted interpretations of social reality and exaggerated estimations of threats. The conviction that Armenians desired to form an independent state was a fantasy of the Young Turks and a few Armenian extremists, which were then written on the whole of the people. The great majority of Armenians had been willing to live within the Ottoman Empire, it was their state, if their lives and property could be secured. They clung to the belief, well into 1915, that a future was possible within the empire. Still, because they had been socialized as Ottomans, this was their home, this is what they knew. Tens of thousands of young Armenian boys actually fought in the Ottoman army in 1914, 1915. Some of them died at Sarıkamış before they were demobilized, their weapons and uniforms taken away, told to dig their own graves, and murdered as the first act in what became a genocide. It's only when their own government, the Ottoman government, turned against Armenians, turned them into pariahs, that some of them did defect and resist. Last paragraph. The intentions of successive Ottoman governments to modernize its empire, in fact, had a baleful effect. It encouraged backwardness. Governments can make their own people even more stupid. The ruined churches, the burnt-out homes, the decaying madrasas, all testified to a policy that made the country poorer, less educated, and less productive. Such policies, first in the 1890s, and later repeated on a grander scale in 1915, 1916, continued in the repressions of Armenians, Greeks, and Kurds in the Kemalist period. And even today, in the Turkey of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, a program of authoritarian homogenization, aimed primarily now at millions of Kurds, drives a country of great potential backwards into a dark future. Thank you.
So, as you will see, I and Ron, do not think along the same lines, but you would be surprised to know that this was more so before. So,
I've improved.
or I have deteriorated. I did not say. Either there is my deterioration or your improvement. So, what I want to say is that, of course, there is no polemics, but we look at things from a different angle, and maybe in the discussion this would be clearer. I will reserve my direct comments on the category of genocides to the round table, since I have the opportunity to speak. But you will see that also in the papers that I suppose some have read, that there are elements of this, let's say, reflections upon the category. In a way, one could say that the easiest way to put my paper is that I am, along with Alex Deval, I'm pushing to say that starvation should be considered an instrument of let's say, mass categorical killing, which is a defining category for our, let's say, for the 20th century, and so that I'm totally in favor of enlarging the category to the sexual violence, as Annette said yesterday. Starvation too is it's something that is necessary to do, also because starvation is not included in the list of the crime against humanity of the 1990s. And I used the Soviet case to prove this, and also to prove how the concept of genocides then become an embarrassment in a way, or a difficulty in analyzing things, but also a useful tool to throw light on other elements. And I used the Soviet Union of the early 1930s to do this. And I do this because I believe this has been underestimated, the heuristic value of the Soviet experience in the 1930s, because you have at least 7 major, great, the definition now standard is great famine is 100,000 people died. Catastrophic famine is 1 million people died. This is what it's now the standard definition. So in the Soviet Union, between 1930 and 1934, there were 5 great famines and 2 catastrophic famines. So I think it's possibly the most interesting period to study this. That starvation and hunger have been used in wartime, not only in wartime, in conflict since the beginning of, as Norman was saying, this has been done always. But the majority of famines up until, let's say, the early 19th century, mid-19th century, were natural famines in a way. Natural in quotation mark, but still were due to natural causes. But one can claim, and I think without problem, that since the mid-19th century, all famines have been political famines. Because since then, the food was always there, and the means to transport food were always there. Hoover was able to bring food to Europe in 1917, 18 with the war, and even to socialist Russia in 1921, 22, 23. So actually, to have a famine in the 20th century, it means somebody's either preventing food from reaching the place or causing the famine. And as an example of the fact that famine as a war instrument was always there, and this is also because I think starvation is not in the list, is because actually, for example, the British strategy in World War I was a strategy of use starvation to defeat the Central Powers. This is why, General von Leeb was acquitted for the blockade of Leningrad, because this was the use of starvation in wartime is permitted under the law. So since there has always been in wartime, but now, and I really found these new famine studies that are especially coming from Africa, where now Africa is the place where all this is happening much more, extremely interesting. And now they write it, I'm quoting Stephen Devereaux and Paul Howe, that the famine, starvation, they say, can be the direct result of peacetime political decision. Governments could aim to create famine, could regard famine as the tolerable or welcome outcome of other goals, or could have conflicting demands that relegate famine prevention to a lower priority. This is really what is happening, and you will see in the Soviet Union, you have all these examples, all of them, in various grades, so it's extremely interesting. So political famines, all famines are political, but not all political famines are the same. And you can distribute them in different kinds and types. Not all of them are direct outcome of faminogenic policies, as it's now the term that Marcus introduced. But famine can be used also to force the submission of people or to alter the course of a nation's or of a people's history. Or just to punish, as he was saying, or to, in a Pavlovian experiment, the Pavlovian vocabulary was very much used by Bolsheviks. They used, we didn't teach a lesson, we should teach a lesson more using famine to do this. You can find this argument all the time. So I think, in a way, the best way, and this is my only piece of direct, treatment of the genocide category, is that starvation belongs to the mass categorical violence category, and its different kinds belong to different subcategory within it, one of which is genocide, of course. The problem is that starvation, the people who study famine, as this is Deval speaking, tend to have a blind spot regarding political and military criminality, and those who study genocide and mass atrocity tend to have the counterpart blind spot on famine and starvation, which is absolutely true. And I think Africa is showing this very well, and it's allowing us to overcome this contradiction. But actually, I would say that if people would study European history, and this is part of my general argument, that juxtaposing European and non-European history, or Western and non-Western history, is a great mistake. In Europe, there were empires, as there were subjugated, let's say, races or nations. There were, peoples, superior people, inferior peoples, like everywhere else. So that there is no need to think of European history as different from the other. And Alex Deval started to do this and uses the famous Nazi hunger plan to do this. And I think this is a good idea, of course, because the hunger plan was very important. The Soviet POW extermination was terrible. There were the ghetto. But, the hunger plan was not then fully implemented, never. Instead, the Soviet Union, I would say, is provides us with a better point of view on this phenomena. And we can rely also on the fact that the Soviet historiography, also thanks to people like Ron, I would say, and Norman and many others, really in the past 30 years, but especially in the 20 years after 1991, has made a huge stride forwards and allow us to see things that before we could not just see and know. So really, I would say it's exploited by other historians, what we learn about the Soviet Union. So I'm now dealing with the Soviet famines the famines and not famine is the important thing, of the early 30s, because once upon a time we were saying the Soviet famine, and everybody started to argue and to fight, because somebody were thinking about the Soviet famine in general, somebody was thinking about Kazakhstan, somebody was thinking about the Holodomor, which are very different phenomena, although they belong to the same general picture. And when you distinguish, many of the polemics go away. And actually, I introduced this distinction because I didn't like the polemics. But now I think that this distinction is scientifically more interesting in general than just to placate the polemics within good faith scholars, among good faith scholars. So these famines, of course, you know that the Holodomor and the Kazakh famine stand out. One, it's 1.5 million people died, Kazakh, 1.3 of them nomads. Numbers are not so precise in Kazakhstan because they were nomads, so difficult. And about 3.5 in Ukraine. So we have about 5 million people died in these two famines, out of about 7 million people who died in 4 years of hunger in the Soviet Union, which is already a big number, as you say. The others, I want to just to mention them, I go into some details in the paper, not great details, but just to tell you, there is, first of all, and I'm sorry Lynn Viola didn't see, but she gave such a great contribution to this, is the kulak famine. The dekulakization provoked about 200,000 people died of hunger because of dekulakization, either being moved to the place or in the place once they arrived. And they were targeted as kulaks. So this was actually a faminogenic policy directed at kulak. In a way, if kulak were a people, this would be genocide without any doubt, because you are singling out a category and killing it or deporting it. So then came, chronologically speaking, the Kazakh famine, which is 1931-32. I will anticipate that we now know, this is very important because it has been linked to denomadization, we didn't know. It has been tied to collectivization. Now we know that the Kazakh died because Stalin, at a certain point in 1931, needed meat, yes, for the rations in the Slavic cities. And so since peasants had killed animals in Ukraine and Russia, he decided to take the nomads' herds to have the meat for the cities. So this was a direct consequence of a specific order to take meat out of nomads. Then, of course, there is the Soviet general famine that was, and Stalin didn't want it, so this is very true. But there were deaths all over, but in very few in Moscow or in big cities, but even in major cities, there were problems. Then there was the famine in the Holodomor, I already mentioned. Then, of course, you have North Caucasus, that Central, okay. So the black-haired regions, and then, of course, and this has not been studied at all, the Volga Germans. The Volga German Republic should be studied because it disappeared, in 1941 after the invasion, but really it's a major case of famine, and apparently mortality rates were as high as in the Holodomor. It's the only place in which they were as high as the Holodomor. So I will not elaborate on all these cases, but if you distinguish them and you use Marcus' category to distinguish them, it's clear you have, Marcus speaks of first degree, first faminogenic behavior when you want them and the intent is there, and second degree faminogenic when is recklessness instead of intent, what provokes the famine. So certainly the kulak and the Holodomor after 32 belongs into the first category, most probably also the Volga Germans, but we don't know. The others are sometimes second that turns into one, or one that then go back to second. So it actually, all these things, as he was saying about the Armenian genocide, all of them can switch from one category to the other. And of course, the last example is the punished people of 1941-44, including the German. I will finish. Just why I think instead, I will finish with this, that you can tie this Kazakh and Ukraine Holodomor to the genocide category. Of course, I don't think there was the intent to destroy the whole population, neither with Kazakh or with the Ukrainian. And with Kazakhs, actually, there was no intent to do anything. I don't think, just they didn't care. They needed the meat, and they take it, and they died, most of them. So this is, I would say, the most crude form of colonial genocide possible. You need something from somebody, you take them, they die. So this was absolutely primitive in a way. So you can read it as a colonial famine, but even this, it's a very specific colonial famine. The Holodomor, and with this I finish in my last 2 minutes, it's much more interesting because I came to estimate Stalin's intelligence very much, studying him. It was very mean, but very intelligent. And he was convinced, and this was Bolshevism also, but he elaborated on this, that you could alter history by using category, social category, manipulating social category, and tools. So you could build people. The term was, nationalne stроительство, so build using tools. And at a certain point, he realized that you could unbuild people using the same tools plus some other tools. And I think that in Ukraine, and it is to me very important that the anti-Ukrainian, the de-Ukrainization measure were in the same decree that called for grain requisition. The same decree get grain, starvation, and let's say take away all the Ukrainian dictionaries and change all the words that are similar to Polish into Russian, take all the books and change them, and so on and so forth, remove all the Ukrainian teachers and close this and close that and deport the intellectual and kill the writers. So you have an approach that say, I built Ukrainian in his mind in the 20s. I allowed them to be built using language and culture and university and immigration to cities. And now I am unbuilding them using both starvation and other instruments in a coherent, very horrible to say, smart, complex, strategic plan that was not built immediately, was not there before. Again, I agree with him here, but it was built over the summer of 32, possibly. Already you can see some part of it in 1930, actually, against the religious. And the idea was, I would say, to alter the history of the Ukrainian people, not to destroy it. With this I finish. But this is nonetheless genocide in the sense that you are, and I think that the situation in Ukraine now is very much a proof of the success of what he did then. So I think really it is an extremely interesting case of the use not only of starvation, but starvation of a panoply of tools to achieve this. I will finish. I had some reflection, but this I will speak of it in a round table about how this shows us that the real thing is to link this resurgence. I agree with Norman, there was always of genocide in the 20th century because there was a resurgence, to state building and unbuilding, how to say, phenomena that were so central to our century. Thank you.
Let me take at least a minute. Let me take a minute at the start. In one of these papers, I can't remember which one, it said, you know, we know so much now about the Holodomor as a famine. Maybe it was in your paper. I mean, to say that 15 or 20 years ago would have been almost impossible, right? I mean, we knew next to nothing. And so I think it's worth saying that the historiography has gotten much richer. We owe a lot to our Ukrainian colleagues. Okay, better? Do I have to repeat everything?
No.
No, okay. We owe a lot to our Ukrainian colleagues. Ludmila Hrinievich is not here, but she'll be here tonight giving a speech. And Stanislav Kulczycki and others who have done fantastic work, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union, you know, in documenting the famine. To Andrea, who's done a lot of work, you know, to the Holodomor Research and Education Council, which has done a tremendous amount of work, as you saw in your 4 books, and you'll notice that a lot of those are co-edited by Frank Sisson, who claims he's not an expert on the Holodomor, but probably knows more than all of us about it. He says, I'm just to the 16th, 17th century, you know. I don't do this stuff, but yeah, you know. But we really owe a lot to them, to the fact that the historiography has become as rich as Andrea has pointed out, and to others. I like the Applebaum book. I mean, Ron and I disagree, but it's a really good 1-volume, you know, history. We finally got that of Holodomor, and now we can go on. And that's a little bit what I'm talking about in the paper, which is how do you think about the Holodomor in a broader context? You know, I suggest there are a number of ways of doing it. One is to compare it to other genocides in history, and Ron, in some ways, is doing that when he compares Holodomor to the Armenian genocide, concluding that it's not genocide. I would conclude differently, but that's a different set of issues. You can compare it to other man-made famines in contemporary history, as has been done by Andrea and others. Especially in communist societies, you know, you can compare it well with what had Great Leap Forward, and even to Pol Pot's induced famines in Cambodia. You can compare it to the Kazakh famine. I think there's been a lot of recent interesting work, comparing it to the Kazakh famine, and things can be teased out of that in many interesting ways. You can think about it as a Ukrainian phenomenon, as many Ukrainian scholars do, and I think you get something from that as well. I don't think these are mutually exclusive approaches. For Soviet historians of the Soviet Union, you can think of it as, in Andrea's book, the Great Peasant War, which starts already in 1917, 1918, and carries forward then into collectivization and the famine. This is one war, in some ways, with many different parts against the peasants, which was carried out. This is a little bit Applebaum's approach as well. And what I tried to do in this paper, and I tried to do some, obviously, some additional work, was to look at the famine, to take what I did in the Stalin's Genocides book, which came out in 2010, I think, and to take it a little bit further and to look a little bit deeper into the continuities between the Holodomor and the other mass killings, what I would call genocides of the Stalin period. And what I wanted to do in this paper was to see, are there these continuities? I mean, you can list event after event, right? But how do these continuities work? And if there are continuities, then it probably means something. And I think there are continuities, and I think it does mean. I agree with myself in the 2010 book, and there have been, criticisms and good criticisms, but, I still think I'm right. There is a period in the 30s, which starts in 1930, really. Khlyavnyuk talks about 1930 as a really seminal point. Doesn't mean there weren't origins before. Going back to 1918 and the Civil War. But, he says, this is when Stalin takes over the Politburo. This is when the Stalinization of the government is done. This is when collectivization, industrialization campaigns are set. This is when dekulakization begins. And therefore, this is the beginning of the period. And you have an end of the period, right? The end of 1938, when Nikolai Yezhev, the horrible police chief, right, NKVD chief, is removed. The war is really coming. I mean, it's no longer, part of Stalin's fantasies. It's really there, and it's really coming, and I think in some ways he finally understands it. This killing, in some ways, comes to an end. It's revived after the war in some ways, but I would suggest not in the same way at all. So you have a period, right, from 1930 to 39, and within that period, we don't know exactly how many people died. I mean, Conquest says 10 million. This is not, this does include the famine, but in incident, that's a lot of people, right? And other people will criticize that data, but, I sort of think that's maybe the rough number. Let me move on here. So what I did in this, I work on themes, I guess. So I have a number of themes here but let me just say what the major stages of this genocide story are. First is dekulakization, which began January 1930, when some 30,000 alleged kulaks were shot, right? And another 2 million sent into exile. Again, numbers are always very tricky, and, people will argue differently about this, but that's, And what Soviet historians do that drive me crazy is they give these very precise numbers, and I'll give you some of them too from NKVD statistics, as if those statistics really mean, that's how many people died. But never mind, that's the best we have. It's better than just guessing, right? You have to at least start with those statistics. Ukrainian kulaks, by the way, were considered, in Hiroaki Kuramiya's words, particularly dangerous. And so they were, attacked in this dekulakization campaign with special fervor and violence. The second thing is the Holodomor itself and the attack on the Ukrainian intelligentsia from 1932 to 33, when 3.5 to 4 million Ukrainian peasants in Ukraine and Kuban died of hunger. In some ways were starved to death. I mean, there's an active verb there. You could say they were killed. I don't know how to say this exactly, and maybe I'll read your paper more carefully, and they were starved. And tens of thousands of urban Ukrainians were, in quotes, repressed as well. Third, there's the Polish and German operations, the largest of the nationality operations, which were very widespread in the 1930s. They began already in 32, 33. Again, this is a real kind of hub of the violence. When the borderlands were cleansed, the Ukrainian borderlands were cleansed of some 15,000 Polish and German families, roughly 50,000 people arrested, deported to special settlements. This found, one of the things, again, in working further in this, the Polish and German campaigns never ended. Operations never ended until 1939, really. I mean, they went on. I mean, if you talk about the massacres of the 22,000 Polish officers, it's part of the same, set of functioning murderous campaigns against these two peoples. You have less sympathy, obviously, for the Germans during the war and what happened to the Volga Germans, but nevertheless, these campaigns went on. By 37-38, the NKVD, just in those 2 years, executed, and this is wonderful NKVD statistics, 105,485 Poles, right? I mean, they go all the way to the last digit, and 75,331 Germans. I mean, I would talk about these as genocidal campaigns. They're picking a nation and they're eliminating. They're eliminating them as a nation. I mean, Snyder talks about them going through the phone book in St. Peter's and in Leningrad and just picking out Polish names, arresting them, deporting them, or shooting them, right? Then there's this famous now, I mean, it wasn't famous again 15 years ago. That's a nice thing about research, right, is 00447, this famous order. Which came in 1937, where at least 680,000 members of a variety of targeted groups were shot. Some estimates go up to 1 million. And again, this is really difficult to know. And it really bugs me about our colleagues in the Soviet field that they won't say that it's really hard to know, that they just use this figure of 680 million. I mean, some people will say, well, it could be up to 1 million. And I think, that is right, and maybe even higher. Then we have the Great Purges, which saw some alleged enemies of the people, groups, of people in society and oppositions eliminated. And it all fits together. Doesn't exhaust the mass murder of the 1930s. As I said, that adds up to about 10 million. And the number of dead, it's very important to understand, if I had maybe another lifetime, I would work on this subject, does not in any way capture the suffering and travails of those who survived. People are starting to work on those who survived the famine, and they find that, it really is a deeply traumatic event, both physically and mentally, and survived the purges and the terror and so on. Okay, so I want to say a couple things really quickly about some of the continuities. One is political leadership, right? And we got Stalin all the way. And we all know, and we don't need to go into detail, or anybody who works in the Soviet field knows, he was into everything. I mean, this is not an aloof dictator. This is somebody who is into this in a very micromanaging way. He decides what the quotas will be. He approves the quotas of killing. There are quotas for killing. He raises the quotas. We even have the documents, where you can see him changing, quotas, raising upwards the number of the supreme penalty, right, death, versus just being set off, to the Gulag. By the way, and many of those people who go to the Gulag or the special settlements, as Andrea said, die. 5 minutes, great. Another part of the continuity of political leadership has to be in the NKVD. And again, Lynn Viola's work comes up. This recent book, Stalin's Perpetrators, a wonderful book in my view, basically deals with middle-level perpetrators in Ukraine, and these are guys who are brutes. I mean, they have barely any education. They participate in the dekulakization campaign, a lot of them. So the same guys, who are beating the hell out of kulaks and sending them off and shooting them in some cases, are also involved in the forced requisitioning. And then they're recruited, to these NKVD offices throughout Ukraine and commit all kinds of crimes. I mean, it's a really incredible story of continuity. And the other thing she talks about is the continuity, sometimes in the judicial area, so that the same troikas who sentence some of the 00447 people, these are sentenced by troikas, and they basically run hundreds of thousands of people through these troikas, sending them either to death or to gulag. The same troikas are operating at the end of the 30s. And they're sentencing sometimes the same kulaks. So if you're a kulak and you're sent off in 32, to a special settlement, you happen to survive or escape, which many of them did in the post-32, 33 period for a number of different reasons. You're then arrested again and shot this time around, right, by the troika. So there's a lot of continuity in the 30s in personnel, in methods, in how they think about what they're doing, and in institutions. The second area of continuity is ideology. And I can't go into depth here, but the ideology in the 30s basically says, closer you get to socialism, the more resistance you're going to have on the part of the population, and you have to deal with that. And so the Soviet Union is on a constant war footing, because they believe also that the capitalist countries will come to get them the closer they come to socialism too. So you get this warlike mentality, and we talked about war last night a little bit, and I would add the Soviet Union to it. There is a fake war being promulgated, by Stalin and the leadership, so that if anyone then dissents from what's being done, they're traitors, right? Because the Poles are out to get them, the Germans are out to get them, and the Japanese are out to get them. And for Ukraine, it's especially the Poles. And people believe this stuff. They follow it. I mean, you have to take ideology seriously. If you read Kopolov's memoirs, he says, I believed this. People were suffering. They were starving. I knew there was cannibalism. But I believed it was the right thing to do, in order to achieve socialism. And he believed, he says, because I wanted to believe. So, this, paroxysm of death and violence that shook the Ukrainian countryside at the height of the famine, was something that was brought about, by the leadership and others. I'm going to have to skip a lot. So, okay. Let me go to this war and security issues business, because it's extremely important to the Polish campaign, the Ukrainians, and Germans as well. I mean, fundamentally, Stalin expressed his worries. We know, he said, we may lose Ukraine. And he says, you guys out there, especially in Ukraine, he's talking to the Ukrainian party leadership, you don't understand Pilsudski, and you don't know that he is going to get us. I mean, there are all kinds of quotes that he's set up organizations that he's going to take Ukraine from us, and you have to do something about it. So clearly, then, he's upset not just about Ukrainian peasants for a variety of different reasons, both as Ukrainian and as peasants. I mean, I've argued that this is kind of one being, but also about Ukrainians as such, meaning as a group, as a nation. And the more, you look at the material, the more, I mean, I'm coming, more over to the kind of Ukrainian argument, which is that Stalin was out to get Ukrainians. Now, of course, you don't kill all the Ukrainians. You can't. We talked about this morning. You can't deport them all, because you'd have nobody to work any of this land at all. So what you do is you break the back of the nation. You break the back of the nation. And how do you break a back of a nation? Well, first of all, Stalin believes that the nationality in this case or nationalism comes from the peasantry. So you use the famine to break them, which in some ways I think people have argued worked. And then you arrest, as he did, 200,000 intelligentsia members, teachers, professors, leaders of the society. You do them, as Frank mentioned yesterday, you get their church, right? And you destroy it. And in some ways, then, you have destroyed the Ukrainian nation that had lived before, as a group, as such. In other words, you don't have to kill them all. You don't have to eliminate them all. But what you do is you replace, in some ways, the Ukrainian nation that was with a Ukrainian nation that you want to be, want to have. And I think in some ways, that happened in the 30s time. Let me just say one final thing, that when Khrushchev came to Ukraine in 39, that sort of ends this period, or 38, he came in 38, ends this period at the end of 38. He was sent here to sort of clean up the mess. The mess was awful, after breaking the back of this nation. And there was nobody left in the party. The whole party had to be replaced. There were no, first secretary, second secretary, they were all gone. The 11 members of the Politburo were all eliminated. Even the leadership, in other words, even the Ukrainian communist leadership, which in itself had bent to the will of Stalin in the course of the 30s, was eliminated because it too was too Ukrainian. So, again, I'm starting down this path, but reading into the documents, there's a lot of very serious evidence, I think, for an attack on the Ukrainian nation as such.
Okay, let me start by thanking the organizers. Everything runs so smoothly and the team is so nice and breakfast is good, so thank you. It's a great conference and it's a pleasure to be here. And let me now move on to the Second World War, but of course there's more links to the other papers than we would commonly think. For instance, the Armenian genocide and the mass atrocities on the Balkans during the Second World War have a lot in common. And there's also mass starvation, forced starvation on the Balkans, not only in Greece, but also in former Yugoslavia. So here are the links. And in my paper, I described a horrendous situation of a civil war that was intertwined with genocide in the independent state of Croatia that existed from 41 to 45. And it's a region of a size of present-day Pennsylvania, and 500,000 people died in only 4 years. So you can imagine the impact of that war on society. I'm discussing a situation where genocides are intertwined with programs of ethnic cleansing enforced and by local nationalists, and that whole situation unleashed a genocidal war and put in motion a social dynamic that got absolutely out of control. Whilst there is a dual occupation on the Balkans, Italian and German forces, both and who are in a way responsible for what happens in 1941, they are both unable to control the situation. They are not even able to defend their own economic interests. And the same goes for the Croatian government. They are not able to control the situation on the ground, to defend their interests against local looters, and so on. So the war I'm describing here also highlights social participation on all kinds of levels in mass violence, especially many locals that partook in lootings as well as in massacres. So a situation that gets out of control and that is also largely characterized by an absence of German perpetrators, even if we look at more organized mass crimes such as the genocide of the Roma as well as the Jews in Croatia during the Second World War, the Germans actually don't play a major role, and that's a very important point I'm going to make here. So I'm not going to present much detail here, and I'm not going to focus on the Ustasha's ideology. I just want to introduce some layers of mass violence that are important to understand the situation and how they were intertwined by looking at wartime Croatia. I will be looking at ethnic cleansing in form of Serbs being deported from Croatia during the Second World War and how their property was looted and redistributed amongst the Croat population. Secondly, I will be looking at massacres in forms of Serb civilians being targeted by Ustaša militias. And also by looking at how those massacres caused an armed resistance that really then resulted in a civil war, so a massive uprising against the genocidaires. And this was both intertwined, ethnic cleansing and the massacres was both intertwined with irregular warfare, with a civil war on the ground, and with mass starvation. And finally and thirdly, I will be looking at those more organized forms of genocide that took place in the region too, the Holocaust of the Jews and Gypsies who were deported from wherever they lived, from the cities and the villages, to Croatian-run camps where this genocide took place. The independent state of Croatia was not a truly independent state. It was formed in 1941 out of the previous Yugoslav state that got destroyed in 1941 by Germans and Italians. And again, it was divided in two zones of occupation, in an Italian and in a German zone, which added a lot, first of all, to the chaotic situation on the ground, but secondly, also opened up opportunities for those who acted on the ground because they could play off the Germans and the Italians against each other. So that opened opportunities and forged the context of that violence. And there was a lot of room to maneuver for both victims and their survival strategies, and for the perpetrators as well. Just very quickly on the Ustaša, they were a paramilitary movement that started running a state in 1941. They were engaged in a lot of terrorism. They succeeded to kill the Yugoslav king in 1934. They were a fascist movement that was engaged in modernist visions of what Croatia should look like. So they were kind of part of the fascist modernist discourse of the time. And were dreaming of an ethnically homogeneous nation state, and ethnic homogenization would also, of course, have would be a pathway for major social changes and societal changes in Croatia. So they would, in a way, forcibly modernize the state. They would be running a greater Croatian nation state as it was envisioned, and that would consist of the Catholic Croatian population, and would also include the Muslim population of about 20% of the general population, who would then be turned into ethnic Croats or were seen as ethnic Croats. But unlike many scholars, that was not clerical fascism, but they were a largely secular movement using religion as an identity marker. Croatia had a population of 6.5 million. Approximately half of those people were Catholic Croat, 800,000 Muslims, and 1/3 of the population was ethnic Serb, and that was the main target group of those perpetrators. That's the population they wanted to purge, and they saw the Second World War as an opportunity for their onslaught on that seemingly alien part of the population. So it's really a case about non-German perpetrators and what they are doing during the Second World War and how they use the war as an opportunity to achieve their goals. And I think the agency, the ideology, and the deeds of non-German perpetrators have so far been still neglected, even in the histories of Europe during the Second World War, whether it's by Messauer or whether it's the Bloodlands, who actually don't talk about Southeastern Europe whatsoever. So those non-German perpetrators have been neglected. So first of all, massacres. There's a great deal of no, first of all, ethnic homogenization. The Ustasha wants to purge the country and starts deporting Serbs to neighboring Serbia on a village level. So it's kind of an organized scheme that targets small town by small town and village by village, which of course then gets out of control and which forces or drives local Serbs into resistance and into an uprising. Secondly, another level is massacres, especially in those regions where the situation gets out of control. Ustasha militias, often not controlled by their state, start killing Serb villagers. And the Germans and the Italians are not very happy about the situation, which is getting out of control. So locally, they appear a bit to act like peacekeepers, a bit like in Holly Case's book on Transylvania, where they kind of want to maintain control, but that ultimately doesn't work. And that results in this situation where basically half of the country is involved in an uprising against the government in Zagreb. It's divided between Serb royalists on the one hand, communist partisans on the other hand. But it's more a coincidence who rules where. It's not really about the identity of the people who follow. If you are Serb, you don't really have the choice whether you kind of join which side of the partisans you join. The Serb nationalists partisans, they engage in genocide themselves. They try as well to create ethnic homogeneity pockets during the war, killing a great number of Muslims during the war. And this is actually one of the most neglected genocides, as I would call it, during the Second World War. It's understudied. There's a lot of Italian involvement in that. The paramilitaries are armed by the Italian army, and they succeed to kill up to 100 Muslims in places that are well known to us, like Srebrenica, where a massacre takes place in 1941. Local civil war induces famine because paramilitaries fight for the crops, and they know that they can harm their enemy by destroying the harvest. So that's a very food-centered approach. And what we have to do is, of course, to follow the violence, and this is why we must not stop in 45. Violence doesn't stop in 45 in Yugoslavia, nor does it in the Western Ukraine. And if we want to understand the social dynamic of violence, we have to keep on going, of course. The final layer here is the Holocaust of Jews and Gypsies. As I told, it was perpetrated mostly in Croatian-run camps with some kind of German involvement, but especially in the case of Roma, there's actually not a great interest from the Germans in what's happening in Croatia and why, they don't invest in the persecution of the Roma. The Croatian perpetrators killed 23,000 Gypsies entirely independently, and 26,000 Jews in a kind of German-Croatian joint venture, which also includes conflicts about what and how this genocide should take place. So it's a genocide that is in a way taking place on a very national level, but it is intertwined with a more on the more international level with what we call the European Holocaust of Jews. Let me finish by opening up a little bit and making some links to other European regions where similar dynamics take place. So Croatian militias killed 300,000 individuals in Croatia, and 500,000 people perish altogether. But similar things take place in, say, Bulgaria, where Bulgarians expel 100,000 Greeks from Thrace, and where also genocide of Jews takes place that is Bulgarian organized with the help of the Germans. In Romania, of course, there is, again, a locally organized genocide of Jews and Roma and ethnic cleansing of Slavs in Transnistria, and Romanian perpetrators to abort their genocide in 1943. It's entirely independent. And here, the forms are also very different with the killing fields in Transnistria, By the way, here the links to the Holodomor have to be explored because it's basically people who survived mass starvation in 1933, and they become eyewitnesses, or they are around once the Jews are being targeted only 10 years later, so we have to study the impact of the Holodomor here. And finally, of course, Ukraine, where genocidal ethnic cleansing of Poles and Jews is taking place in Volhynia and parts of the western Ukraine, where also local perpetrators get out of control, where the German militias, where the German armies are largely unable to control the OUN, and where all kinds of forms of violence become intertwined, and where it's also about ethnic cleansing and forming a future territory or state with the post-war in mind. And of course, there is the Great Famine in Greece, which is in a way the larger context, and the Greek Civil War, which is also so similar to what I've been describing for Croatia, with 300,000 deaths. Ironically, often these non-German perpetrators manage to present themselves as rescuers after the war. That's true for Bulgaria, that's true for Italy. So the genocides they have organized have been kind of sidelined, ignored, or silenced altogether. But their crimes matter. They show how intertwined local crimes were with the Holocaust. They show how independent local perpetrators acted, how their persecution of Jews could be entirely independent, following an own rationale and not the German rationale. They show how various forms of violence were entangled, and indeed it's civil wars that broke out in so many parts of Europe during the Second World War, and we have to study those civilized, some were more and some were less ethnicized. And they show a massive popular participation in all of those cries. So studying this will help us to Europeanize the history of violence during the Second World War, and that's what we're going to need to do. Thank you.
Thank you for those wonderfully rich papers in such a tight time frame. We now break for coffee for 15 minutes, and we'll come back for discussion. But first, please join me in thanking our panelists one more time.